You are now listening to Playbook Radio. Here is your host, Martin Williams.
And welcome to Playbook Radio. My name is Martin Williams. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. You may do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. All the links to the podcast can be found at gameplanplaybook.com. That's gameplanplaybook.com. And I really appreciate each and every one of you that chooses to listen and interact with me through the podcast. I really appreciate it. So today's podcast title is Think Big but Finish Small. So playbook principle number 22 is always be closing, put a finish on something. And I got that from Steve Harvey, who is, of course, a well-known international TV host, comedian, and he said this on one of his radio programs some years ago, and he always preaches this, to always be closing and always be finishing something. And it really stuck with me because, over the course of my life, I had problems with finishing, and I didn't really want to admit it at the time. But it really helped me to become more of a finisher, right? And really, we only get rewarded for what we finish, right? When you think about it. And, it's important that we finish that which we start. And this is a good habit to have. So what does that have to do with today's topic? So a lot of times people get overwhelmed because they have problems finishing, and it becomes kind of a negative feedback loop. You have problems finishing something, and then the unfinished projects in your life, the unfinished things in your life tend to pile up. And you get overwhelmed, and now you really don't want to finish. And then, you basically reach, critical mass where you either quit or you start over. And there's times in life when you have to start over. I've done it. You've done it. We've all done it. But you don't want to make a habit of starting over every time, right? Because, we're here for a limited time, and you get to a point where, you can't start over anymore, or maybe it's just too late to start over. So you want to get into a habit of finishing. But if you find yourself behind, if you find yourself, let's say, in a lot of debt, let's say you're behind at work, let's say you're behind at home, let's say you're behind in any area of your life, you want to think big, right? So when I talk about thinking big, the first thing I want you to understand is that, we'll use money for an example. If you're in $100,000 of debt, the goal is not $100,000 because that just brings you to zero. You want to think surplus. You want to think beyond that, right? Because you don't want to get into a point where, you're at zero, and what will you have to do? You'll probably have to borrow, right? You'll probably have to borrow more money instead of, being in surplus. So the first thing that you want to do is that you want to think big. And my example in thinking big but finishing small was the story of the George Washington Bridge, which connects New York and New Jersey. And so when they built this bridge, and I believe it was in the early 20th century, probably like 1920, somewhere around there. When they built this bridge, obviously they didn't have the technology that they have today. But at the time, it was one of the longest suspension bridges, built in the world. And in connecting New York and New Jersey, they would have to build something where there weren't, or where there wasn't really like a lot of support in the bottom, right? Now, I'm not an architect, so I don't have the terminology down, but basically what would hold the bridge up would be the suspension because of the logistics and the way that the Hudson River was. It just wasn't feasible to build a bridge, the standard bridge where the support came from the bottom, it would come from the top of the bridge, right? But because of the technology and because of the cranes and things like that that they had available at the time, the amount of steel that it would take to support the bridge, they didn't really have cranes that could handle that type of weight. So what they had to do was that they had to, essentially elevate small pieces of steel, and use those pieces to basically, make up the difference, to make up the amount of suspension that would be necessary to support the amount of weight that would be traveling on that bridge. And the George Washington Bridge is one of the busiest bridges in America and probably the world, because of the traffic that comes in and out of New York City. So it handles a lot of weight, right? But it could only have been done because of the ingenuity of the architects and the engineers to think of it that way. So in essence, what they did is that instead of trying to do a big thing at once, they did it in small increments. Those small pieces of steel wire being uploaded and basically bringing all those wires together to form something strong enough to hold the bridge up. So when you think about your goals, you want to start thinking in terms of that. You don't want small goals. A lot of people say, well, you got to pick a small goal, right? And I get why they say it, but here's the thing. Like I said, sometimes you just need more, right? Back to that example, $100,000. If you're $100,000 in debt, $100,000 brings you to zero. Okay. So you really want something like 200,000 because it would give you surplus. Instead of buying a 3-bedroom house, right? You might say, well, we really need a 4-bedroom with the amount of space that we have, or the amount of space that we need. We really need a 4-bedroom. But you might feel like, well, we can only afford a 3-bedroom. When it would make more sense to think in terms of, okay, if a 4-bedroom, what's the difference between a 4-bedroom and a 3-bedroom in costs, right? The 4-bedroom might be $50,000 more, right? Wouldn't it make sense thinking of the down payment, right? And as long as you can get approved for the loan, the down payment would probably be maybe 10 grand more. Wouldn't it make more sense to save towards that as opposed to just saying, well, we're just going to get a 3-bedroom, because you'd have to move again and you don't know how life is going to work. It may not be a good time to move in 2 years. So you want to think big instead of thinking small, but you want to finish small, right? If you have 50 things to do at work, stop looking at the 50 things, pick one thing and finish it, right? And that, you've probably heard something along those lines before. But even if that one thing seems big, pick a small thing, a piece of that, and finish that, right? You might want to start running, and you want to start running 2-3 miles a day. But if you've never run before, 2 to 3 miles, that's too much. So run 50 feet or 100 feet, or run a quarter of a mile. And then tomorrow, do it again, or whenever you're up to it again, right? But you want to start finishing small. Now you might say, well, I didn't finish the 2 miles, but you're resetting the parameters, because you did finish, right? You finished. And what you're going to do is you're going to start closing over and over again, right? Yeah, I didn't run 2 miles, but I ran a quarter mile, right? So tomorrow I'm going to run a quarter mile again, and now I'm closing, right? It's really just a little bit of a mindset shift. Instead of thinking in terms of, well, I can never get out of that much debt. Why not just pay $100 and then just pay that off, right? You might have a collection item that's $200. That $200, did you pay the debt or not? Yeah, you paid it, right? So you finished, okay? And you're always, because you want to get into the habit of always closing, right? If you need clients, yeah, go after the big clients, but you may have to go after a small one first. You might have to get someone who, maybe it's a $50 or $100 contract, right? But you just want to get into the point of always be closing, right? But think small. Finish small. Think big, but finish small, right? Because when you pile up all the finishes, all the things that you finish over time, right? What that does is that it gives you the confidence, it gives you the history, and pretty soon you start going after those big fish because you started small, okay? One more thing that I wanted to share with you. There was a guy who used to teach stock market, right? And he was a cab driver, and he said that the money is made in the meter drop. So the way that the cabs used to work, for all you younger people, is that whenever you got into a cab, the cabbie would push the meter down and that would start the meter running. And then, once you get to your destination, that's what you paid, right? So over time, that was replaced with technology. And of course, now we have Uber and Lyft and all these other things. But, his philosophy was that a lot of cab drivers in his city would go to the airport so they could get big rides. But his philosophy was that he would just take the small rides, and, eventually he would make more money than the guys and the girls who would, basically sitting at the airport all day because they were wasting time. Okay. And what it does for me is that it basically piggybacks on this particular principle of just always finishing. You want to always finish. It doesn't matter like how big the client is. It doesn't matter how big the mountain is. Conquer the smaller hills and the smaller obstacles that are on the way to the big mountain, okay? Because where you're going to have to always be finishing, right? If you're going to work for yourself, and I do the Sprint to Freedom thing where I'm helping people go from being an employee to an employer, you're going to have to always be finishing. You're going to always be looking for opportunities to bring in income because you can't depend on one thing, right? If you depend on one thing or one contract or one provider and that provider shuts down, you're in trouble because, your mortgage, your employee salaries are all dependent on this one person or this one company, right? How many companies now are depending on government contracts, and all the government has to do is have a shutdown, which they've already had this year, right? And that company is up the creek basically because they were so dependent on that one provider. Get into the habit of always be closing, always be finishing. Put a finish on something. Finish. Whatever you got going on, finish small. And then in time, you're going to start finishing big. So thank you so much for listening. My name is Martin Williams. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to Playbook Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast with family and friends. And if you're ready to take the next step in your personal development journey, consider trying Mental Recoding by Playbook Strategies. These short audios are designed to help you reprogram your thoughts around different life subjects, such as finances, health, work, relationships, and much more. Click the link below to explore mental recoding products to help reshape your mind.